Testing, microphone. Is this screen on right here? I can't see it. Is it showing? I mean, this one? Okay. Test. Testing. What's that? Okay. Well, wait a minute. All right. Welcome all. We are in week 5 here. We are going to talk about 2 major judges tonight. I mentioned last week that there are 6 minor judges and 6 major judges. Tonight will not be as rated PG-13 as last week, but there's still biblical violence and some other stuff that we'll see tonight. Again, just a reminder of these judges. They are not usually judges in the terms of we normally think of a judge in a judicial courtroom sense. We did see Deborah operate that way a little bit, but she's really the only judge in the book of Judges that does operate in a judicial capacity. These really are redeemers, rescuers, saviors, deliverers. And so I had this up last week that I saw this church did a saviors, which I kind of like that terminology here because we really go downhill from Deborah. You know, when she's kind of the peak of the judges in terms of being, I guess, godly, holy. Remember, she is looked to as a prophet, a prophetess by the people. They come to the tree that she sits under to consult with her. When Barak says that she doesn't want to go into battle unless Deborah goes with him, that's not out of cowardice. It is because he recognizes that Deborah really is a messenger from God, and that God trusts her, and so he wants her to come with him. So after Deborah, we really start to kind of go downhill in our judges in terms of, not just in terms of how godly they are, but also, as I mentioned, there's some jerks and idiots in here too that we come across, and people that in our own lives we would think, oh, I would never want to be friends with this person, and so the term broken saviors, I kind of like that. Terminology here for the book of Judges, because it really is showing that these people were used by God still, and this is this book to me is a message of hope for us. We look at the book of Judges, and I think even though we don't see ourselves in the same capacity, in terms of violence or sexual deviancy or something like that of the judges, we recognize our own brokenness, and we think to ourselves a lot of times like, oh, how could God use me, or why would God want to use somebody like me? And the book of Judges is really a message of hope that was written for the Israelite people, but really is a message of hope for us as well, that we can look at them and think, man, if God could use this person, then surely God could use me as well. Just a reminder here that set up the book of Judges. This is in Joshua. Therefore the Lord was very angry with Israel and said, because this nation has violated the covenant I ordained for their ancestors and has not listened to me, I will no longer drive out before them any of the nations Joshua left when he died. I will use them to test Israel and see whether they will keep the way of the Lord and walk in it as their ancestors did. The Lord had allowed those nations to remain. He did not drive them out at once by giving them into the hands of Joshua. So just a reminder there that under Joshua's leadership, God was driving out the peoples of the promised land. But now because of the people of Israel, their forgetfulness, their sinfulness, God says, I'm not going to do that anymore. These people are going to be a test for you to see if you'll stay true to my laws, my commandments. And of course, we know that they do not. We see the cycle of the book of Judges here over and over and over again. The people become forgetful. They fall into sinfulness. A foreign ruler oppresses them. They call out to God for a rescuer. God sends a judge, a rescuer, a redeemer, a savior. And then there's a time of peace. And then what happens during the time of peace? The people become forgetful. They fall into sin. They fall under the oppression of a foreign ruler. They cry out to God. God sends a rescuer. There's a time of peace. They become forgetful. Over and over and over again, the book of Judges shows us how that happens. And again, I think when we look at the book of Judges, we recognize that in our own lives, our forgetfulness of all that God has done for us, our sinfulness, and how that can lead into a time when we have to call out to God again to redeem us, to rescue us. Here's some other pictures of that, but what's that? This one? I will be saying, did everybody get the slides this week from last week that I sent out? Okay, thanks to Jeremy for doing an investigation last week. We had heard that only half of you were getting the emails I was sending out with the slides. So Jeremy finally figured out why that was happening. I sent them the new way earlier this afternoon, so hopefully you got them. And I'll send another email. For those of you who weren't getting the emails, I'll send an email from weeks 1 through 3 with all the slides, just so you have those as well. And I'll send out these tonight again as well. Our first judge that we encountered was a man named Othniel. We didn't have too much about him in his story, but he was our first major judge. Then, of course, we had the story of Ehud and King Eglon that we walked through last week that had some crassness and violence to it, obviously. Then we real quickly had the story of a minor judge named Shamgar. We'll see that again tonight and next week as we close out the book of Judges, that there's those 6 minor judges. And sometimes we really only have a sentence about them, like this one was about Shamgar. We really don't have much about them. We get basically one sentence. Then, of course, we had another major judge in Deborah. And in the midst of the Deborah story, remember she tells Barak, okay, I'll go with you, but because you won't go without my presence with you, then Sisera, the general, is going to be delivered into the hands of a woman. And of course, we would all assume, reading the story, that means it's going to be Deborah. But it's not. It turns out to be Jael. Here's the Jezreel Valley. Our first story tonight with Gideon will take place in this same valley here. Again, this is from a place called Megiddo, or what will later be called Armageddon. That red arrow is Nazareth. That green arrow is Mount Tabor, where Deborah and Barak fought against Sisera. And then the blue arrow there on the far right is Mount Moreh. So that's going to be part of our first story tonight with Gideon. And here's that Jezreel Valley, kind of an aerial view on a map. It's shaped like an arrow. The arrow basically points to a mountain range called Mount Carmel. If you've been to Israel with me, you've been there. We went to Elijah's cave. That's the story of Elijah the prophet and him fighting the prophets of Baal. Takes place at Mount Carmel. He lived in a cave there. And so that's going to come into play in our first story with Gideon tonight as well. As is the shaft of the arrow there that kind of goes out to Beit Shan. That's the route of escape that the Midianites are going to take in the story of Gideon tonight. Here again is a bunch of entrance ways into and out of the Jezreel Valley. Remember again that this valley for thousands and thousands of years has had thousands and thousands of battles fought in it. It's what you wanted to control. It's what you had to control. If you're an empire like Assyria, Egypt, Babylon, Rome, any of these empires throughout biblical history, if you wanted to fight against each other, you fought over this tiny piece of land that is the modern day Israel and is the promised land at this time. You had to fight over that land. And if you wanted to control that land, you had to control this valley. So thousands of battles have been fought here. We see multiple battles throughout the Bible fought here, including Deborah last week, Gideon tonight. Saul fights the Philistines there. Of course, in the end, it makes sense then that John in his book of Revelation would talk about the final, ultimate battle, Armageddon, being fought here in the Jezreel Valley as well. This is a little hard to see, but I put it up, or you can look at the slide later. It basically lays out the kind of the geographic land formations that form the valley. That's going to come into play tonight with the story of Gideon. Here again is the escape route for Sisera and the Canaanites. Of course, he escapes. They're all slaughtered. He escapes. He comes to the tent of Jael that we looked at last week. And it's her, the woman. She's the woman that he has delivered into her hands, Sisera, as she drove the tent peg through his skull, through his temple, through his mouth, depending on how you translate that. Again here, here's the picture of Jael about to drive the tent peg through. We, of course, paired that with the story of Judith and how both Jael and Judith crushed the head of their enemies, their oppressors, and we linked that to Mary, the mother of Jesus, and how she gave birth to the person, the Savior, who crushed the head of the oppressor as well. And those are the three women that are called most blessed among women. There's Jael, Judith, and Mary, the mother of Jesus. Any questions or comments on that? We ended pretty quickly last week to close out Deborah and Jael's story. So I don't know if you have any questions or comments on that before we get into Gideon. So the question is, why is the valley so important? So again, if you look at a map, I wish I had a map that showed this, but Israel was called the land between because it was the land between all the empires. So you had Egypt to the south, you had Babylon to the east, you had Assyria to the north, Rome is going to come from the north. All these surrounding empires, if they want to fight each other, they all come and fight over this little land between, which is where Israel exists. And if you want to control that land so that you can, march your armies into the other empire's territory, you had to control the Jezreel Valley. So we have outside of the Bible, we have stories of Egyptian pharaohs fighting in the Jezreel Valley, and we have all stories from other people groups outside of the biblical record that talk about fighting in the Jezreel Valley, because everybody recognized it was the land between. What we call the modern-day nation of Israel, or what we're looking at here with the Promised Land, the land of Canaan, that was the land between. It was in the middle of all those empires. So you wanted to control that land. And again, to control that land, you had to control the Jezreel Valley. So that's why so many battles get fought there, because you wanted to control that little stretch of land in order to advance your armies or defend your land, defend against the invading armies. Any other questions or comments? So Gideon, he is one of our major judges. You may know a little bit of his story, or some of his story may sound familiar as we go through it. but he is one of the major judges. So we begin his story here. Not surprisingly, the very beginning of his story begins, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and for 7 years he gave them into the hands of the Midianites. So once again, our cycle of judges is starting over again with this new judge. There's been a time of peace. The people have become forgetful. They have fallen into sin. They did evil in the eyes of the Lord. They did what was right in their own eyes. And so for 7 years, they're oppressed by the Midianites. Because the power of Midian was so oppressive, the Israelites prepared shelters for themselves in mountain clefts, caves, and strongholds. So what it's talking about there is that Mount Carmel. So this is all taking place around the Jezreel Valley. That Mount Carmel that's out on the coast I was telling you about, that is kind of where that arrow, the shape of the arrow of the Jezreel Valley points out to. It's on the coast. It's where the story of Elijah later takes place. The same cave system that Elijah will make kind of a home for himself in as he hides there at the caves of Carmel are the same caves that they're using now. The Israelites are using these caves to hide from the Midianite oppression. Verse 3, whenever the Israelites planted their crops, the Midianites, Amalekites, and other eastern peoples invaded the country. They camped on the land and ruined the crops all the way to Gaza and did not spare a living thing for Israel, neither sheep nor cattle nor donkeys. They came up with their livestock and their tents like swarms of locusts. It was impossible to count them or their camels. They invaded the land to ravage it. Midian so impoverished the Israelites that they cried out to the Lord for help. So it tells us they came at harvest time. The reason that you would do that, if you are this army of the Midianites and Amalekites and you're oppressing the Israelites, the reason you come at harvest time is if you wait until after harvest time, now the Israelites have harvested all their crops and wheat and everything else, and they've stored it and even probably had a chance to hide it. So they could survive a siege, they could survive a long time without that. You come at harvest time because not only does it stop the Israelites from having a food supply, but you as the Midianites and Amalekites, you have a large food supply. So you didn't come way before the harvest because nothing is there for you to consume. You didn't come after the harvest because the Israelites have harvested all. You come at harvest time so that you can keep them from having a food supply, and your whole army has their own food supply if you just, pick those crops. The fact that they ravage it, they trample it, they stomp the crops, so whatever they didn't consume, they destroyed, so that the Israelites would not be able to have it. It was an extremely cruel thing to do because it was their entire livelihood. If you had no crops and you had no chance to prepare to store things up, and your entire crop was destroyed, then it threatened your actual lives. Your actual livelihood was in jeopardy because of that. So keep that in mind when we get to the story of Samson. The cruelness of what the Midianites have done here to the Israelites will come back in our story of Samson tonight as well. So, of course, the Midianites have oppressed the Israelites for these 7 years. So what do the Israelites do that we see in the cycle? They cry out to God for help. When the Israelites cried out to the Lord because of Midian, he sent them a prophet who said, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. I rescued you from the hands of the Egyptians, and I delivered you from the hand of your oppressors. I drove them out before you and gave you their land. I said to you, I am the Lord your God. Do not worship the God of the Amorites in whose land you live." That's a kind of a callback to, remember, Joshua in Joshua 24:15. Choose for yourselves this day who you will serve, whether it's the God of the Amorites in whose land you're now living, or whether it's Yahweh, whether it's God. So this fact that this prophet here is saying this, delivering this message from God, we don't know who this prophet is. It's an unnamed prophet. It's actually the first one we encounter in the Bible, although we encounter some others later. But we're never given the name of this prophet. But the message, I am the Lord your God. Do not worship the gods of the Amorites in whose land you live, but you have not listened to me. And the angel of the Lord came and sat down under the oak in Ophrah it's not Oprah. That's the word there. Oprah. That's actually good. Her name comes from the book of Ruth, and we'll see that next week. Oprah Winfrey's name. This is Ophrah. Oak in Ophrah that belonged to Joash the Azarite. where his son Gideon was threshing wheat in a winepress to keep it from the Midianites. So when you thresh wheat, we're going to talk more about this next week in the story of Ruth, this wheat and threshing floor. But basically, to process wheat when you harvest it, you put it on this large threshing floor, like basically, like we would think of big rock, concrete, something like that. That way you could let the bad parts blow away and the good parts stay. Again, we'll talk about it more next week in the story of Ruth because it matters more there. But why it matters what Gideon is doing here is he's not using a threshing floor like you normally would to process the wheat. He's using a wine press. So that makes it a little more inconspicuous for the Midianites to see what he's doing. So that's why it says he's doing this to keep it from the Midianites, because if he's on a wine press, they won't assume automatically that he's processing wheat and go to try to stop him. When the angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon, he said, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." "Pardon me, my Lord," Gideon replied, "but if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us?" I love Gideon's question here. I mean, how many of us have asked that in our lives? I love the book of Psalms because we see David and others in the book of Psalms constantly have this same question for God. If you're really on my side, if you're really on our side, why is all this happening to me? Why is all this bad stuff happening in my life? Why can't I catch a break? So we see that in the Psalms. We see it here with Gideon, that this angel of the Lord says, calls him mighty warrior. The Lord is with you. Well, if that's so, why is all this happening to us? 7 years we've been under the oppression of the Midianites. If God is really on our side, why is all this happening? Where are all his wonders that our ancestors told us about when they said, "Did not the Lord bring us up out of Egypt?" So he's saying, what if God's really on our side, why would all this stuff be happening to us? Where is all these great things I've heard about? All we hear about from our ancestors, all the stories passed down, is how God fought for us. God fought for our people, brought us out of slavery, got us across the Red Sea, swarmed up over the Egyptian army, led us into the promised land, led us across the Jordan River. The waters consumed our enemies again, delivered us in Jericho, delivered us delivered us the promised land. All we've heard about are the great things that God did for our people. Why is that not happening now? Is Gideon's question. Where are all these wonders I've heard about? But now the Lord has abandoned us and given us into the hand of Midian. The Lord turned to him and said, Go in the strength you have and save Israel out of Midian's hand. Am I not sending you? And Gideon said, Well, pardon me, my Lord, but how can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my family. So an interesting thing, because it reminds us again of Moses at the burning bush, coming up with these excuses to God, like, what? How could I be the one that you're choosing? It can't be right. I can't be the one. Gideon's saying, not only is my tribe kind of the weakest tribe of all of the tribes of Israel, but my family is the weakest family and the weakest tribe. Like, why in the world would you choose me? Why would you call me mighty warrior? And the Lord answered, I will be with you, and you will strike down all the Midianites, leaving none alive. Gideon replied, If now I have found favor in your eyes, give me a sign that it is really you talking to me. Please do not go away until I come back and bring my offering and set it before you. And the Lord said, I will wait until you return. So this is one of the first tests of Gideon. He's going to kind of test God here. And again, the fact that he's testing God should automatically remind us there's a verse that says, do not test the Lord your God. We see that with Jesus being tempted in the wilderness, that he quotes that scripture, thou shalt not test the Lord your God. What is Gideon doing? Testing the Lord his God. So right from the start we see Gideon's definitely not on Deborah's level. This is right after the story of Deborah. So again, we kind of have taken a decline here in our quality of judges, at least how they start. Not necessarily how they finish, but how they start as people. And so this is going to be one of the tests that Gideon has. Gideon goes inside, prepares a young goat from an ephah of flour. He made bread without yeast. Put in the meat in a basket and his broth in a pot. He brought them out and offered them to him under the oak. So he offers this messenger of God. The significance of that is he brings an ephah of flour, and he makes basically unleavened bread. There wasn't time to make leavened bread that rose, so he makes leavened bread, basically like a big cracker. This is enough to make about 10-inch size, like rounded pieces of unleavened bread. That would have been really significant amount of food at this time when they're being oppressed and their crops are being destroyed. So Gideon's reckoning, so this is kind of our back and forth like of Gideon and some of the other broken savior judges. Like, okay, he's testing God, which isn't good. He shouldn't be doing that. But we also see him recognizing this messenger as being from God by the fact that he's offering him this, significant sacrifice. Not sacrifice in the sense of like a burnt offering, but it was a sacrifice for him to be able to offer this much food to this messenger of God. So again, we have this back and forth. Well, he's doing good here. He's not doing good there. What kind of guy is Gideon here? The angel of the Lord said to him, take the meat and the unleavened bread, place them on this rock, and pour out the broth. And Gideon did so. Then the angel of the Lord touched the meat and the unleavened bread with the tip of the staff that was in his hand. Fire flared from the rock, consuming the meat and the bread, and the angel of the Lord disappeared. When Gideon realized that it was the angel of the Lord, he exclaimed, alas, sovereign Lord, I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face. But the Lord said to him, peace, do not be afraid, you're not going to die. So keep that in mind tonight. That's going to come back in our story of Samson too, this idea that if you see the face of God, that it meant you were going to die. That was good theology. That was right. That's what had happened in the past. And so the fact that God says, hey, don't worry, you're not going to die, tells us that he was right. He was right to think that he would die. But God tells him, don't worry, you're not going to die just because you've seen my messenger or me face to face. So Gideon built an altar to the Lord there and called it the Lord is peace. To this day it stands in Ophrah of the Abiezrites. So he doesn't bring a sacrificial offering at first. He is offering a meal to the messenger of God. The messenger of God and the Lord basically turn it into a sacrifice by having him place it on this rock and it being consumed by fire, and then Gideon building an altar to the Lord. It becomes this sacrificial offering from Gideon to the Lord. That same night the Lord said to him, take the second bull from your father's herd, the one 7 years old. Tear down your father's altar to Baal and cut the Asherah pole beside it. Then build a proper kind of altar to the Lord your God on the top of this height. Using the wood of the Asherah pole that you cut down, offer the second bull as a burnt offering. Okay, there's some weirdness going on. We don't really know what this is all time. Why a second bull? Why 7 years old? Why does any of this matter? It matters because in the NIV, it makes there's only a designation really of one animal. If you look at other Bible translations in the English, it talks about it in terms of two bulls. But just by the fact that it says here second bull makes us assume there's a first bull. There must be a first bull if there's a second bull here. You don't need to have a herd. You don't need a lot of bulls because one bull can father lots of children in your herd. So bulls were often sacrificed young. So the fact that this bull is 7 years old tells us that this is a good breeding bull. It was an extremely important bull to have in your herd, the fact that it's 7 years old and hasn't been killed sooner for meat. So that's taking the second bull. The first bull is probably a bull. Sometimes you had a bull that wasn't good for breeding, so you castrated them and kept them around to help you work the fields and other stuff. And so the fact that there's a first bull here probably tells us the first bull is one of those, like a gelded bull that is probably the one that Gideon used here to pull down the Asherah pole. This Asherah pole that was basically a pole recognizing the goddess Asherah, and this altar to the god Baal. The first bull is probably the one Gideon used to help tear those things down. The second bull that's 7 years old is the one that God tells him to offer as a burnt offering. So Gideon took 10 of his servants and did as the Lord told him, but because he was afraid of his family and the townspeople, he did it at night rather than in the daytime. He knew the people were not going to be happy with what he's done. It talks about the Asherah pole and the altar of Baal being his father's, but they were probably really community things. So the community would come and pray at the Asherah pole, the altar of Baal, for good crops, to be fertile, all those things. So Gideon knows they're going to be unhappy that the fact that he's torn them down, so he does it at night. In the morning, when the people of the town got up, there was Baal's altar demolished with the Asherah pole beside it, cut down, and the second bull sacrificed on the newly built altar. They asked each other, who did this? When they carefully investigated, they were told Gideon, son of Joash, did it. The people of the town demanded of Joash, bring out your son, he must die, because he has broken down Baal's altar and cut down the Asherah pole beside it. So this, in the story of Gideon, this sacrifice is being used as a precursor to the battle that's going to be fought. It's interesting that the messenger of God, when he comes to Gideon, calls him mighty warrior. We see the same word used later, but it's translated in English as person of standing, man of standing, which it could mean here for Gideon, recognizing him as a man of standing in his community. But we translate it mighty warrior because it's supposed to tell us that there's a battle coming. Gideon's going to lead the people into battle to rescue them from this foreign oppression. So this sacrifice here is kind of a precursor to that. Here's the part of the first test there. The meat and the unleavened bread upon the rock and it being consumed by fire. But Joash replied to the hostile crowd around him, are you going to plead Baal's cause? Are you trying to save him? Whoever fights for him shall be put to death by morning. If Baal is really a god, he can defend himself when someone breaks down his altar. So basically what he's saying there is like, you guys are really here to take Baal's side? Like, you're going to fight for this just piece of nothing like rock that we call an altar of Baal? You're going to plead his case? You're going to be on his side? And even if you are on his side, it's not your place to avenge the destruction of this altar. Baal can do it himself. If Baal's really a god, he'll do it himself. And so this is Gideon's father kind of talking them out of killing his son Gideon. And he says, let Baal contend with him, or let Baal contend with Gideon himself. We're going to skip some of this just for time's sake. Verse 36, Gideon said to God, if you will save Israel by my hand as you have promised, look, I will place a wool fleece on the threshing floor. If there is dew only on the fleece and all the ground is dry, then I will know that you will save Israel by my hand, as you said. And that is what happened. Gideon rose early the next day, he squeezed the fleece and wrung out the dew, a bowl full of water. So here's another test by Gideon, but Gideon isn't satisfied with this test because the test is, okay, I'm going to put this basically sheep's wool, a fleece, out, and it's on the threshing floor, which is like hard concrete. So in the morning, what would you expect to be the case? The hard ground around it is dry, and the soft, absorbent fleece would be wet. So it's not really a surprise this has happened. And Gideon seems to realize this after he wakes up and finds it. Oh yeah, look at this fleece. It's a bowl full of water, and all the ground is dry. And then he thinks to himself, wait a second, wouldn't that just normally happen? Doesn't that happen every day here? Like maybe God's asleep. Maybe he didn't hear me. Maybe he didn't hear me ask him to do this. So he follows up. So Gideon says to God, do not be angry with me. Let me make just one more request, and allow me one more test with the fleece. But this time, make the fleece dry and let the ground be covered with dew. And that night God did so. Only the fleece was dry and all the ground was covered with dew. So this is Gideon, putting God to the test here. And, again, he realizes, well, that wasn't much of a test, so I got to have him do it the opposite way and flip-flop it. And, of course, God was listening the whole time and, does what Gideon asked. The fleece is dry this time. The ground around it is wet. So, again, we have this kind of pre-battle ceremony or ritual that's happening here with Gideon. Here's him with the fleece. Here's another of him. With this, you can see in this one he's wringing it out, kind of that water that's coming from it. He's wringing it out there. Okay, so tests are over. Any questions or comments on the test that Gideon asked of God? Mm-hmm. The question is essentially, who is the angel of the Lord and how is this communication happening? The author makes it I don't want to say confusing. It makes it kind of a back and forth. Because what you're saying is like, it says the angel of the Lord or the messenger of the Lord. The word is just kind of messenger. So sometimes we see that people assume what we know as an angel, they just assume is a human messenger. That like another prophet, like we have the unnamed prophet we heard from. So a lot of times we see them assume, okay, this is a person who has been sent by God to give me a message. And it's later they realize also, oh no, it was an actual angel. So there's a back and forth. Even when it says, okay, the angel's talking to Gideon back and forth, put it on the rock, it's consumed by fire, and the angel disappears. And then right away it says, the Lord said to Gideon. So there's that like, all of a sudden, wait, like God was there? Now God's talking directly to him before he was talking through the messenger? But it's supposed to intentionally be vague because it's supposed to show us that the messenger really is a messenger from God. So God communicates through the messengers, through the angels, just as if it's his own voice. In fact, we see like at this time, two heads of state would never meet to talk. You always sent an emissary or something like that. And they were seen as talking directly for the head of state. So it's not much, Gideon wouldn't think of this as much different to hear a message from a human messenger that he knows is coming from God, or an angel that he would absolutely know that is being sent by God, and then this idea of him hearing God's voice directly. So it's all supposed to kind of come together as these are truly messengers of God that are being sent. Yeah. The question is about angels, and sometimes we see in the Bible an angel will refuse to accept an offering, and other times, like in this case, the angel is accepting the offering or commanding the offering from Gideon, and whether there's a difference there in like between messengers of God or angels of God. I mean, the short answer is probably yes, there's a difference. The longer answer is we don't know what it is. Without trying to get too much into what's called angelology, like the theology of angels or messengers of God, is a whole study that people get into. But we're not given a name here of this angel like we are sometimes. We're given, Michael, Gabriel, we're given names of angels or messengers of God. But again, the line is blurred here between who's speaking so that we know that this is coming from God. So that the messenger that is accepting the offering here by Gideon, or commanding that he is put it on the rock so that he can turn it into a burnt offering from God, is to show us that this is a message directly from God, which is why we have the switch all of a sudden. The angel disappears and all of a sudden God's talking directly to Gideon. So the author wants us to know this was all coming from God. Other times we see messengers of God that, yes, are saying, I can't accept this, or hold forth your sacrifice. We see that a little bit when we get to the story of Samson. So we'll come back to that as well in our other story tonight. Yeah, Jim?
What would be your opinion of using this,
Putting out a fleece today? Yeah. I guess in the sense of like us asking for signs or something like that. I think there's a difference between an oracle type sign that Gideon is doing here. This was a common practice at the time of the surrounding people groups, but also we see the Israelites do it sometimes, and they normally did it with two of the stones that are in the breastplate of the high priest. Now, clearly, Gideon doesn't have access to these two stones to be able to inquire of God what God wants. So he uses this other oracle kind of test of the fleece. I think there's a difference between kind of that incantation oracle test, like that we would ask of God, versus when we ask God for a sign of discernment and distinction. When we say, I don't know what to do in my life, God, like, show me what you want me to do. Show me what you want out of my life. And by, our friends and discussions with friends and family, discussion with our pastors, discussion with our friends, reading the Bible, being in silence before God, we have a discernment of what God would want us to do with our life. Whether that's something large and grand or something, more, I guess, short term. So I think there's a difference between this kind of incantation test that Gideon does that seems to be condemned in the Bible and us simply asking God for discernment. Like, give me a sign, and usually what we're meaning is give me the right choice to make. Like, show me what the right choice is. And that comes about from us being in community with one another as Christians, talking to pastors, family, friends, and making a choice, making a discernment. I had a professor in college that he talked about. He was a professor at APU where I went to school, and then he became a pastor up in Fresno. He was always talking about the onion fields in Fresno, but he became a pastor up there. Then APU wanted him back as a professor, and he thought, okay, I need to make a decision. Like, what do I need? What should I do? Like, which is the right thing to do? So he was praying to God. Should I go back to being a professor, stay a pastor? And he kept hearing this message, or it kept coming into his mind that there was a man in his church, one of the other elders, that he was having a dispute with. And he kept hearing God say to him, you need to go fix your relationship with this guy. You need to go fix your relationship. And he kept praying, okay, I'll do that, but I really need to know, should I go back to being a professor or stay a pastor here? And over again, he just kept hearing, you need to go fix your relationship with this other person. So finally he said, okay, I understand that this is what I need to do. He goes, meets with this man, they reconcile. He comes back and says to God, okay, I did that. Now what should I do? Be a professor or stay a pastor? Silence. He said, never heard from God. Which one are you supposed to do? And he understood that the thing that God was most concerned about was his relationship with that man, or the relationship with his surrounding community. And really he thought, okay, the choice was mine. God's going to honor my decision whether I go back to being a professor or I stay a pastor. And that happens to us, I think, a lot in our lives. Sometimes, it's not that God has dictated every step of our life and there's only one, right way to take. It's more like a choose-your-own-adventure book. Remember those choose-your-own-adventure books? Like, if you want to do this, turn to this page. If you want this, turn to this other page. And when we're in right relationship with God and each other and living by Micah 6:8, to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God, that's what God asks of you, then sometimes, God is going to honor our decisions. So it's not always a case of we just simply pray and ask God for a sign and we're always going to get a clear answer. But it's a good question. I think a question that probably all of us have asked and ask now and will ask again of ourselves and of God. Any other questions or comments? Okay. So the part of the story that you if you're familiar at all with the story of Gideon, you might be familiar with this part of his story. Early in the morning, Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, they gave him the name Jerubbaal because he basically fought against the god Baal, Jerubbaal, and all his men camped at the spring of Herod. The camp of Midian was north of them in the valley near the hill of Moreh. The Lord said to Gideon, you have too many men. And you got to think Gideon at this point is like, I beg to differ. We need as many people as possible here for this battle. And God says, I cannot deliver Midian into their hands, or Israel would boast against me, saying, my own strength has saved me. Now announce to the army, anyone who trembles with fear may turn back and leave Mount Gilead. So 22,000 men left, while 10,000 remain. You got to think Gideon's sweating a little at this point. Oh man, that was a huge hit. But okay, we got 10,000 left. That's pretty good. But the Lord said to Gideon, there are still too many men. Take them down to the water, and I will thin them out for you. And Gideon is thinking, I don't need them thinned out. There's no situation here where I'm asking them to be thinned out here. If I say this one shall go with you, he shall go. If I say this one shall not go, he shall not go. So Gideon took the men down to the water. There the Lord told him, separate those who lap the water with their tongues as a dog laps from those who kneel down to drink. 300 of them drank from cupped hands, lapping like dogs. All the rest got down on their knees to drink. So again, here's where this is taking place in part of the Jezreel Valley. Some of you, if you've been to Israel with me, have been to this place. So we're looking across the valley at Mount Moreh. We're standing on, in this picture, Mount Gilboa, where the Israelites are, looking across to Mount Moreh, where the Midianites are camped. Here's kind of another picture of that. Here's the camp of the Midianites by the hill of Mount Moreh. Here's what is so-called today the Cave of Gideon, also called Herod's Spring, since it's in that region. You can go and you can actually visit this cave. It's highly doubtful this is what it would have looked like at the time, if this is in fact the cave. But this is a cave that a spring comes out of at the base of the mountain, that we are told that Gideon takes the army to drink from a spring at the base of this mountain. So it's gotten the tradition of being the Cave of Gideon. So you can imagine again here, the people, here's a picture, there's some people that are kind of all down and they're either lapping the water. Look at the guy on the far left. He's actually drinking directly from the water, like putting his face in the water. And then the one next to him who's kind of bringing it up to his mouth, versus the one that's kind of in a crouched position there. And you got to think that Gideon, as he's looking at these people, he knows that the ones that are lapping up like dogs are the ones that he needs to take with him, and the rest are going to go away. The ones drinking the other way, where they bring the water to their hands, he's got to just be thinking like every single one of them that comes to the edge of that water, he's probably thinking, okay, lap it up like a dog, lap it up like a dog, And 9,700 times they don't do that. only 300 do that. Here's in modern day Israel. These are Israeli defense soldiers. They are here at the Cave of Gideon, or the spring there, kind of reenacting this as well. So the picture here is, if you're flat on your stomach and you're bringing the water a short distance up to you, you're number one, you're not an easy target. You're more inconspicuous laying down, and you can be looking at what's happening around you. So you can be aware of any enemy that might be advancing against you as you're drinking. Somebody who is kind of crouched down and they're bringing the water up to their face, you're higher up, so you're an easier target, and you're looking down at the water instead of looking out where the enemies are. So it's only 300 of them that get down kind of flat on their stomachs, and where they're not an easy target, can watch the enemy, and they just bring the water a short distance to their mouth. So with these 300 men, God says, with these 300 men I will save you and give the Midianites into your hand. Let all the others go home. So Gideon sent the rest of the Israelites home, but they kept the 300 who took over the provisions and trumpets of the others. Now the camp of Midian lay below him in the valley. During that night, the Lord said to Gideon, get up and go against the camp, because I am going to give it into your hands. Then we'll skip these words. Basically, he says, if you're still worried, because obviously God knows, okay, you kept giving me all these tests to show you. If you're still worried, go over there at nighttime and you'll hear what the people are talking about. Sure enough, Gideon goes over there. Here's one of the enemy talking to another person about his dream he had. Clearly, the dream is about Gideon's victory in this battle. So this is God confirming with Gideon again that he is on his side. Verse 15, when Gideon heard the dream and its interpretation, he bowed down and worshiped. He returned to the camp of Israel and called out, get up, the Lord has given the Midianite camp into your hands. Dividing the 300 men into 3 companies, he placed trumpets and empty jars in the hands of all of them with torches inside. Watch me, he told them, follow my lead. When I get to the edge of the camp, do exactly as I do. When I and all who are with me blow our trumpets, then from all around the camp, blow yours and shout for the Lord and for Gideon. Okay, here's what's happening. You got trumpets, number one. Now, and you've got these jars that have basically like a candle wick inside them. And if you have a candle at home and it's burning and you place the lid back over it or something to cover it, the flame goes out. So it's kind of like that, but there's a little bit of air to get in. So they're kind of smoldering in these jars. Now, when you open it, the flame's going to get bigger and be able to illuminate what's around you. So they're supposed to have one of those jars or torches in one hand and the trumpet in the other. Now, this was common at the time if you were going to fight a battle at night. But what happened was a very, very small percentage of your army would have the trumpets and the torches. They blew the trumpets to signal the attack of the army. They held the torches so that it would, illuminate things for the rest of the army. And the vast majority of the army, what did they have? Well, they had swords and shields, of course. Like, you attacked with swords and shields. So an extremely small percentage of your army would have trumpets and torches. So when the 300 of them all have trumpets and torches, and they blow the trumpets, and they light up the torches out of these jars, what do the Midianites think? But they're hearing this is a huge army that's about to advance against us, because we can hear 300 trumpets blowing and all these torches. That must mean the army is gigantic, really big for them. So that's the picture we have here of Gideon. So they blow the trumpets, break the jars. Verse 21, while each man held his position around the camp, all the Midianites ran, crying out as they fled. When the 300 trumpets sounded, the Lord caused the men throughout the camp to turn on each other with their swords. That was a common expectation at the time, that a god or goddess fighting on your side would cause confusion in your enemy. And so that's kind of the picture we have here. God is causing confusion in the Midianites, and they're turning on each other. So here's the Israelites with their trumpets and torches, not their swords and shields, but they don't need the swords and shields because the Midianites now are turning on each other. Here's kind of a picture of that. Trumpets blowing there. We're going to watch, to close out Gideon's story a little bit here, we'll watch another one of those 3-minute videos that's kind of the Rocky and Bullwinkle fractured fairy tale style version like we saw last week with Ehud and with Deborah. So, Jeremy, do you have that?
Gideon, the children of Israel versus the Midianites.
The Midianites have destroyed our crops.
Yeah!
They've raided our towns.
Yeah!
And for 7 years we've taken it. But today we fight. We fight for our freedom.
Gideon! Gideon!
Gideon! Here's the thing. God says there's too many of you. What? Look, guys, it's great that you came out, that you all want to be heroes, but the fact is, if 22,000 Israelite soldiers leap into battle, well, it won't really seem like a miracle when we win. Anyone who wants to leave, go for it. God, I really hope you know what you're doing. That's a start, I guess. Let's, I'll have a drink. You, and you. You're in. Everyone else can take off. Okay, here's the plan.
Hey, the Israelites.
Yeah, all 300 of them. Ooh, we're so scared. We're running in fear.
You'll be serious once you hear our music.
Why? Is it that bad?
No, it's miraculous.
Stop it. Get away from me.
I don't know what's going on. You, get away from me!
OMG-D, I think it's working.
Don't stop!
The Midianites fled the land, and Gideon led for 40 years of peace, until the Israelites started sinning again, lost God's favor, got conquered, turned back to God, and started the cycle of judges all over again in Samson versus the Philistines.
which is where we're heading now. But there is a little bit more to Gideon's story. We're going to skip over it. Basically, they pursue them, the army farther. But I do want to show you. Here we go. In Gideon's death, Midian was subdued before the Israelites and did not raise its head again. During Gideon's lifetime, the land had peace 40 years. So again, our expectation of that cycle here. He had 70 sons of his own, for he had many wives. His concubine who lived in Shechem also bore him a son, whom he named Abimelech. Gideon, son of Joash, died at a good old age and was buried in the tomb of his father Joash in Ophrah of the Abiezrites. And then look at verse 33. No sooner had Gideon died than the Israelites again prostituted themselves to the Baals. They set up Baal-Berith as their god and did not remember the Lord their God, who had rescued them from the hands of all their enemies on every side. They also failed to show any loyalty to the family of Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, in spite of all the things he had done for them. Then we actually get a story of a man named Abimelech. It's one of Gideon's sons. He basically kills all 70 of his brothers, the other sons of Gideon. And then he himself is killed. And we will come back to the end of his story next week when we get into another judge called Jephthah. We're kind of going to do Jephthah and a Levite next week, kind of end our book of Judges before finishing with the book of Ruth. But right now we're going to look at the story of Samson. Any last questions or comments on Gideon? Okay, Samson. He is certainly seen as like a superhero. Here's just over the last few years. This isn't even recent because it ends at 2019. All these superhero movies that we have coming out and in our theaters, I've talked about this before in previous weeks. Like the movie-going community seems to have a huge appetite for superhero movies, and certainly Samson was kind of one of those original. In fact, a lot of people know Cecil B. DeMille did the Ten Commandments, the movie The Ten Commandments, Charlton Heston. But I think 7 years before that, he actually did a movie called Samson and Delilah. It was the highest grossing movie of the year in 1949, doubled all the other movies. So even then, people had an appetite for Samson. Of course, we're going to get to this part of his story tonight of him fighting or destroying this lion. There's been comic books made about Samson. The one on the right, Samson, is from, I think, the 1930s. So there's a whole comic book series about Samson. The one on the left was Hanna-Barbera. In either the 60s or the 70s, there was a series called Young Samson and Goliath. Now, it's not Goliath like David and Goliath. Goliath was there's a boy, and his name was Samson, and when he tapped his bracelets together, he became, huge and strong like Samson, kind of like Incredible Hulk-esque. And then his dog was named Goliath, and the dog became a lion. So that was an actual Hanna-Barbera, same ones that make Yogi Bear and all that stuff. They made this series of Young Samson and Goliath there. So we certainly, Samson has been, that part of the appeal of his story is his superhero-ness, I guess. There's a lot of parts of his story that appeal, especially when we try to communicate them to kids. But we're going to talk about Samson's story tonight as not the flannel board. Remember flannel board, when you're a kid in Sunday school and you put up the little flannel board stuff? I always say stories like this are not flannel board material because they're not the stories that we normally tell. The stories that kids would tell. So we're going to watch this short video of kids talking about Samson.
Once there was a guy named Samson. Sam has beautiful hair like Rapunzel. No, not like Rapunzel, like the afro.
It was just long and braided and cute.
God told Samson never to cut his hair because it was his strength. He really sounded like the Hulk. Samson saw a beautiful woman. Hey, there's Delilah. Oh, Abba. Woo, woo.
And Delilah said, "What are you looking at, you disgusting ape?" No, that's what I would have said. But she probably said, "Ooh, Samson, you're so strong. Ooh." Gross, that's disgusting.
The creepy bad guys went to the Lila and said, find out his secret superpowers of his strength. So we can beat him up. We can give you some money or something like that.
Delilah kept bugging him and saying, Samson, where does your strength come from? And he lied every time because he wasn't supposed to tell her.
Delilah keeps nagging him. Nag, nag, nag. Nag, 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 nag. Samson freaked out and he said, be quiet. I will tell you.
So Samson disobeys God and tells her that his strength is in his hair. Men aren't very smart, are they?
Delilah shakes all his hair and he loses all his strength. He looks ridiculous. And now the bad guys capture him. They beat him up and throw him in jail. But in jail, his hair gets to grow again.
Then one day the Philistines are in the temple and they bring Samson in to make fun of him. You can't fight. You can't fight.
He probably told him to quack like a duck. Quack, quack, quack.
Samson prays to God and asks God to give him his strength one more time.
God listened to Samson and gave him super strength like Superman. He pushes down the timber and everything is destroyed. And everyone dies. The end.
So that is the flannel board version of the story of Samson. Probably the version of the story of what most of us just kind of know about Samson in general. It's the part of the story that, appeals to kids, obviously. And I've all along said there's nothing wrong with trying to teach kids biblical stories that are on their level. There's a reason that we don't have the kids in here tonight to hear the story of Samson, because it's important to teach them at their age what they can understand and help them understand stories of the Bible and relate to the Bible. But we completely forget about, and as this video did, about Samson's early life, what happened before all this. In fact, if I said Samson's wife, most of us would just assume I'm talking about Delilah. But he had a wife before Delilah. In fact, we don't even think he was or know that he was married to Delilah. Let's get into his story here. At the birth, again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. No surprise there. So the Lord delivered them into the hands of the Philistines for 40 years. A certain man of Zorah named Manoah from the clan of the Danites had a wife who was childless, unable to give birth. The angel of the Lord appeared to her and said, you are barren and childless, but you are going to become pregnant and give birth to a son. Now see to it that you drink no wine or fermented drink, and that you do not eat anything unclean. You will become pregnant and have a son whose head is never to be touched by a razor, because the boy is to be a Nazirite, dedicated to God from the womb. He will take the lead in delivering Israel from the hands of the Philistines. So here, some of you, again, have been here in Israel. This is the Sorek Valley, where Samson is from. Just keep this picture in mind. It's in an area that's kind of there's the hills where Jerusalem are, where a lot of the Israelites are living at this point. Then there's the coastal plain where all the Philistines live. In between there is a region called the Shephelah, the low-lying hills. And they have these wide, flat valleys like you can see here. Here is standing on the ruins of, actually this is a drone, so it's not standing, but above a place called Beit Shemesh. We're not going to get into that story, but we see the town of Beit Shemesh numerous times in the Bible. But this is, again, looking down the Sorek Valley. On the very top right of the picture there's an industrial park. That industrial park today is called the Zorah Industrial Park. It actually preserves the name of Samson's hometown, because that's where Samson's hometown was, up on the slope of that hillside there in a place called Zorah. So a messenger comes to comes to Samson's mother. It just calls her the wife of Manoah. We don't even get a name for his mom. It says a messenger of God, an angel of God, comes to her and gives her this message. You know, you're not supposed to cut his hair. He's going to be dedicated to the service of the Lord because he's the one that's going to deliver the Philistines into the hands of the Israelite people. So she goes and tells Samson's father this message that he's heard. Samson's father says, I need to hear this for myself. What's interesting is the author tells us the messenger comes back to Samson's mother, not to his father. But the father's there, so he hears the message being given, again, verbatim. Doesn't change a single word. The angel of God gives this message again to Samson's mother. You're not to cut his hair. He's going to be dedicated to God. He's going to deliver the Israelites into the Philistines into the hands of the Israelites. And then they're expected to give this sacrifice here. So Samson's father took a young goat together with the grain offering and sacrificed it on a rock to the Lord. And the Lord did an amazing thing while Manoah and his wife watched. As the flame blazed up from the altar toward heaven, the angel of the Lord ascended in the flame. Seeing this, Manoah and his wife fell with their faces to the ground. When the angel of the Lord did not show himself again to Manoah and his wife, Manoah realized that it was the angel of the Lord. We are doomed to die, he said to his wife. We have seen God. So here again, remember when God says to Gideon, don't worry, you're not going to die. You're not going to die. So here Manoah is assuming the same thing. Samson's father is, we saw an angel of the Lord. We saw the face of God. We're going to die. But his wife answered, if the Lord had meant to kill us, he would not have accepted a burnt offering and grain offering from our hands, nor shown us all these things or now told us this. So I always say it's like Samson's father Manoah, he's a good theologian. He's right that if you see the face of God, you're going to die. So he's a good theologian. Samson's mother's a better one. she understands the message that's coming from God, and she kind of says, well, if God was just going to kill us all along, why would he give us this message or tell us to do these things? And Samson's father's like, yeah, I guess that's true. Why would he do that? I guess you're right, honey. So the woman, Samson's mother, gave birth to a boy and named him Samson. He grew and the Lord blessed him, and the Spirit of the Lord began to stir in him while he was in Manasseh down between Zor and Eshtaol. So that's the beginning of Samson. He's born. He is growing up in this area where there's exciting things happening behind Samson up in the hills of Judea, up where Jerusalem will later be founded. There's exciting things happening there. There's exciting things happening on the coast where the Philistines live. They've got cities, they've got, nightclubs and bars and pretty women. And he lives in this very, very boring area. And so that's our setting here as we begin the next part of Samson's story. Samson went down to Timnah and saw there a young Philistine woman. So if you think about the picture I had up of the Sorek Valley, that valley that he's from, where we were taking the picture from, where his hometown was, at the end of that valley is the city of Timnah, and that belongs to the Philistines. So this whole area that Samson lives in doesn't really belong to either the Israelites or the Philistines. Sometimes they get along pretty well, sometimes they fight over it, and it's just whoever's stronger then controls that area. And there's all these little valleys going down. There's the Ayalon Valley, where a couple weeks ago we talked about the sun standing still in the story of Joshua. Next is the Sorek Valley, where Samson is from. One valley down is the Elah Valley, where David fought Goliath. So there's all these little valleys going down, and they're kind of pathways or lifelines between those two areas. So Samson's living in this kind of in-between area, and he goes down the valley to a Philistine town of Timnah and sees this Philistine woman. When he returned, he said to his father and mother, I have seen a Philistine woman in Timnah. Now get her for me as my wife. That's quite a demand there. His father and mother replied, isn't there an acceptable woman among your relatives or among all our people? Must you go to the uncircumcised Philistines to get a wife? But Samson said to his father, get her for me. She's the right one for me. So right away, when Moses in his farewell address, Joshua in his farewell address, God throughout the book of Deuteronomy and into Joshua, what do they keep saying to the Israelite people? Don't start worshiping the gods and goddesses of the people in whose land you're going to be living or taking over, and don't intermarry with them. Don't marry the foreign women. Well, right away we have Samson here. He goes down, sees a pretty Philistine woman, and tells his mom and dad, get her for me. Just go get her for me. I like the look of her. Go get her for me as my wife. And of course, they beg him. can't you marry another one of the women from the tribe of Dan that we're from? Or any other of the other tribes of Israel. Choose any of them, and we'll arrange the marriage for you. He says, nah, I like her. Go get her for me. So Samson went down to Timnah together with his father and mother. As they approached the vineyards of Timnah, suddenly a young lion came roaring toward them. The Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon him so that he tore the lion apart with his bare hands as he might have torn a young goat. But neither his father nor his mother, but he told neither his father nor his mother what he had done. Then he went down and talked with the woman, and he liked her. A couple of those things, the sentences stand out to me in this passage and always seem funny to me. First of all, it says he tore a lion apart with his bare hands as he might have torn a young goat. Is it easy to tear a young goat apart? Like, that's a never, like, always seems strange to me. Like, is that an easy thing to do? I tell you this, like back in the 90s, there was this thing called the Power Team. These big, strong, muscular guys that would lift weights. They were a Christian group, and they'd go around to, Christian camps and events. And one of their, shticks was they would tear a phone book apart. Like they'd have a big phone book. We don't have those anymore, really. They'd tear a phone book apart to show how strong they were. I always think, was it easy to tear a young goat apart? But then the other thing, he went down and talked with a woman, and he liked her. So clearly it tells us before there was no, connection, chemistry between them. He just liked the look of her. He said, I saw a pretty young Philistine woman. Go get her for me as my wife. Then later he finds out, I kind of like her. She is kind of a nice person. We're never told how she feels about him. But certainly we're told here that he likes her. That's probably too small for you guys to read, huh? Sometime later, when he went back to marry her, he turned aside to look at the lion's carcass. And in it, he saw a swarm of bees and some honey. He scooped out the honey with his hands and ate it as he went along. When he rejoined his parents, he gave them some, and they too ate it. But he did not tell them that he had taken the honey from the carcass of a lion. Now his father went down to see the woman, and there Samson held a feast as was customary for young men. When the people saw him, they chose 30 men to be his companions. So he's traveling back down now. He sees this carcass of this lion he had killed before, and there's a swarm of bees in it, and there's honey now. So he scoops some down and is walking along and eating it, which is already strange. Then he gives some to his parents and doesn't tell them where he got it from, which is probably a good idea, not to tell them. They make it back down to where this woman is. Basically, they're going down. They've arranged the marriage. They're going down for the wedding festivities. And 30 men from the Philistines have been chosen to basically be Samson's groomsmen. It's kind of the picture we're getting there. Now, this is taking place during the wedding feast. Let me tell you a riddle, Samson said to them. If you can give me the answer within 7 days of the feast, I will give you 30 linen garments and 30 sets of clothes. That would have been very expensive. So this is a significant wager or bet here. If you can't tell me the answer, you must give me 30 linen garments and 30 sets of clothes. Tell us your riddle, they said. Let's hear it. He replied, out of the eater, something to eat. Out of the strong, something sweet. For 3 days, they could not give the answer. On the fourth day, they said to Samson's wife, his new wife, coax your husband into explaining the riddle for us, or we will burn you and your father's household to death. Did you invite us here to steal our property? So here's what's happening. The wedding has happened. The wedding feast, like what we'd call reception, lasted about 7 days. So in the midst of all these festivities, he says, I got a riddle. This will be fun. Let's make a little bet. It'll be a friendly bet. And if you can figure out the riddle, then I'll give you this very expensive, clothes and linens. If you can't figure it out, then you have to give it to me. So they, of course, can't figure it out. His riddle doesn't make any sense. Here's a riddle. Oh, did that not come through on that slide up there? That's weird. Do you see it on here? Okay. Here's a riddle. What smells better than it tastes? Well, the answer's there. A nose. You could also do it the other way. What tastes better than it smells? A tongue. That's a riddle. So you can figure it out. Like, it's something that can be figured out. The riddle that he gives them, out of the eater, something to eat, out of the strong, something sweet, has no reference in daily life at the time. It'd be like if I made that bet with you, and I said, here's my riddle. I had this for breakfast a few weeks ago. It was like, what? There's nothing to figure out. You can't figure out like that. So you would lose that bet. So it's a trick from the start. This is an unfair wager that Samson has made with them. The reason that's significant is this is his new wife's family. It's her people. So they're upset, obviously, like, and telling her, like, what, did you just bring us here to these festivities to rob us? Like, we can't figure out this riddle. Go find him. And then, of course, they threaten, if you don't help us figure this out, we're going to burn you and your father's household to death. So here's this poor woman. Imagine you're her. You've been given in marriage to this foreign man, Samson. We have no idea, again, how she feels about this marriage, but it's probably a scary thing to be given to this somebody who's not from her people. And now she's put in a position between the two of them. Okay, do I keep the seat, or do I remain faithful to my brand new husband, who I barely know, or do I be faithful to my people? So she's put in a position like, they're going to burn me and my father's household to death if I don't go find this riddle out, but my new husband's going to be really upset with me for betraying him. So it's a horrible position that this woman is being put in here. But Samson's wife threw herself on him, sobbing, "You hate me. You don't really love me. You've given my people a riddle, but you haven't told me the answer. I haven't even explained it to my father or mother," he replied. "So why should I explain it to you?" Which is a funny thing to say when you think about it in terms of the Bible talking about a man will leave his father and mother for, and be joined to a woman. So his question, well, I haven't even told my father and mother. Why would I tell you? The answer is obviously because she's your wife. But in Samson's mind, he doesn't see it that way. She cried the whole 7 days of the feast. That must have been fun. So on the seventh day, he finally told her, because she continued to press him. She in turn explained the riddle to her people. Before the sunset on the seventh day, the men of the town said to him, "Well, what is sweeter than honey? And what is stronger than a lion?" And Samson said to them, "If you had not plowed with my heifer, you would not have solved my riddle." So not a great start to the marriage here, that not only does he put his new wife in this position of betraying him or her own people and robbing her family, he also calls her a cow. If you had not plowed with my heifer, you would not have solved my riddle. So not a great start from Samson here. So they answer, what is sweeter than honey? What is stronger than a lion? But again, remember that there's no way that they could have figured that out. Out of the eater something to eat, out of the strong something sweet. That's not something that's an everyday occurrence you would see and think, oh, it's probably a lion's carcass that he scooped some honey out of, There was nothing to figure out. This was an unfair bet from the start, a trick from the start by Samson here. Then the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon him. He went down to Ashkelon, struck down 30 of their men, stripped them of everything, and gave them their clothes to those who had explained the riddle. Burning with anger, he returned to his father's home, and Samson's wife was given to one of his companions who had attended him at the feast. So here's Samson, gives an unfair wager from the start. There's no chance that these people can win, except that his wife gets the answer from him and tells them. So instead of living up to his end of the bargain and giving these 30 linens and 30 sets of clothes, what does he do? He goes to another Philistine city, a city that's also one of her people, the people that he has been in the midst of this wedding celebration with, goes down to another city, kills 30 of their people, takes their clothes, takes their linens, and brings them back and says, "Okay, here you go. I'm paying off my bet," which he really wasn't. It wasn't his linens and garments that he was giving them. He killed some other Philistines and took it from them and brought it back there. So burning with anger, he returned to his father's home. And Samson's wife was given to one of his companions who had attended him at the feast. So he doesn't take his new wife with him when he goes back to his hometown farther up the valley. And then his new wife is given to one of his groomsmen. We have a short, Jeremy, do you have the short video here? It always reminds me of this. Go ahead, Ty.
That's why, to me, a wedding is like the joining together of a beautiful, glowing bride and some guy. The tuxedo is a wedding safety device created by women because they know that men are undependable. So in case the groom chickens out, everybody just takes one step over and she marries the next guy. That's why the wedding vow isn't, do you take Bill Simpson? It's, do you take this man?
I was thinking of that clip because that's basically what happens. She just marries the next guy over. One marries one of the groomsmen. Samson's mad. He goes, he leaves her, and they marry her off to the next guy over. They just bump him over there. Later on, at the time of the wheat harvest, Samson took a young goat, customary during time of probation, and went to visit his wife. He said, I'm going to my wife's room, but her father would not let him go in. I was so sure you hated her, he said, that I gave her to your companion. Look, isn't her younger sister more attractive? Take her instead. Samson said to them, this time I have a right to get even with the Philistines. I always laugh at that line because it's almost like he recognizes that before his actions were dishonorable. Like he said, this time I have a right to get even with you. When he went down and killed 30 Philistines that took their linens and garments and gave it to pay off his unfair wager he made, it's almost like he recognizes that that was an honorable thing to do. This time I have a right to get even with the Philistines. I will really harm them. So he went out and caught 300 foxes and tied them tail to tail in pairs. He then fastened a torch to every pair of tails, lit the torches, and let the foxes loose in the standing grain of the Philistines. He burned up the shocks and standing grain together with the vineyards and olive groves. Okay, so a weird story. He gets foxes, ties their tails together, puts torches in them, sends them down this valley. So remember, he's sending these foxes down this valley to burn up all of the agriculture, all of the crops of this valley of the Philistines. So that's what I wanted you to remember earlier when I talked about the cruelness of the Midianites and what they did to the Israelites. Because Samson's doing the same thing here. This is threatening the very lives and livelihood of the Philistine people that he has just married into. To burn up all of their crops, all of their grain, all their wheat, all their agriculture means they have no food to eat. And so this is a direct threat to their very lives that he would do this. The same thing that we saw that was called so cruel that the Midianites did the Israelites, Samson is now doing to the Philistines here. So he sends them down this valley again, like the Sorek Valley. Basically, you can kind of see a lot of the agriculture out in the middle of this wide, flat valley in the Sorek Valley today. And sending these foxes down there would have burned all that up. It's interesting, you know, like we have Smokey the Bear. Only you can prevent forest fires. A couple of decades ago, Israel had their own version of Smokey the Bear, but it was a fox with its tail on fire. And it comes from the story of Samson here. And in the war for independence in 1948, Israel fought. There was a battalion called Samson's Foxes. So they still have recognition of this story in their daily lives today. When the Philistines asked, who did this? They were told Samson the Timnite's son-in-law because his wife was given to his companion. So the Philistines went up and burned her and her father to death. Samson said to them, since you have acted like this, I swear that I won't stop until I get my revenge on you. He attacked them viciously and slaughtered many of them. Don't you realize that the Philistines are rulers over us? What have you done to us? So the Philistines stayed true to their word. They were upset of what Samson has just done to them, and they burn his wife and her father's household to death. So this is, again, it's a horrible situation this woman has been put into here in her life, and she suffers greatly by this horrific death as well as a result of Samson's actions. So the Israelites now are the ones who come to Samson and say, don't you realize the Philistines are rulers over us? What have you done to us? And Samson says to his fellow Israelites, I merely did to them what they did to me, which is not true in the least bit. Like, what is he talking about there? I merely did to them what they did to me. Like, we can see from his story that that's simply not true. What have they done to him? All the oppression is coming from his side to this new family that he's married into. The only thing we can think of, he's talking in generic terms of like what the Philistines have done to Israel. But Samson doesn't say it that way. He says, I merely did to them what they did to me. Samson, we're not going to be able to finish his story tonight. We're going to see more of his story. He has a very selfish focus in his mind. We're going to talk next week as we conclude Samson's story about how the author of Judges sets Samson up as the anti-Moses. In other words, they're the opposites. Remember how I had the chart up for a couple weeks that showed how Joshua and Moses were very similar? The author was always trying to show us how Joshua was like Moses and all their similarities. I'll put one up next week that shows you how opposite Samson is from Moses. And part of that is his selfish focus here. They said to him, we've come to tie you up and hand you over to the Philistines. Samson said, swear to me that you won't kill me yourselves. And so they swear, we won't kill you, we'll just hand you over to the Philistines. And they do. And finding a fresh jawbone of a donkey, he grabbed it and struck down 1,000 men. Then Samson said, with a donkey's jawbone I have made donkeys of them. And donkeys in this is like we would think of a donkey. So making donkeys of them. With a donkey's jawbone I have killed 1,000 men. Again, this is one of those things that's anti-Moses. Moses crosses the Red Sea. His sister Miriam leads them in Miriam's song, and Moses repeats it. Horse and rider he has thrown in the sea. All the glory to the Lord. And look at Samson's victory song. It's all about him. With a donkey's jawbone, I've made donkeys of them. With a donkey's jawbone, I have killed 1,000 men. When he finished speaking, he threw away the jawbone. Because he was very thirsty, he cried out to the Lord, you have given your servant this great victory. Must I now die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised? Then God opened up the hollow place in Lehi, and water came out of it. When Samson drank, his strength returned, and he revived. So the spring was called Anakor, and they are still there in Lehi today. So again, this is the opposite of Moses. Moses gives glory to God, has a song of victory, and then when the people cry out, Moses intercedes and provides them water. Samson, on the other hand, almost insults or rebukes God for not giving him water. And then when he is given water to drink, he names the place after himself, whereas Moses named the place after God, that God had provided the water. So we'll see more next week on how Samson is very much the anti-Moses here. And then in the middle of our story, Samson led Israel for 20 years in the days of the Philistines. Well, what is that missing? In our cycle of judges that we see over and over again, we're told Samson led the Israelite people for 20 years. What's missing? The time of peace. And so we'll pick up his story next week, looking at the violence of Samson and how his story, his judgment over his judging over Israel, he rescues them, but there's not the time of peace like we see with the other judges. His life is a continual, mess of violence and sexuality, and that'll begin. We'll start next week with the story of Samson and Delilah, which of course is what most of us think of when we think of the story of Samson. But look at all that's happened in his life before we even get to his interactions with Delilah and the end of his story there. So there's a lot that goes into his life. We're going to talk about next week. This is one of the people I talked about who's, simply a jerk. There's kind of no other way around it to think like this is not somebody you would want to know in your own life, Samson. But how is God going to use him? How is God going to redeem Samson? And we'll finish with the end of his story next week, looking at how God does that with Samson and how that, again, should give all of us hope even within our own lives. And then we'll look at two stories in the book of Judges next week after we conclude Samson's story. Jephthah and his daughter, and a Levite and his concubine. They are two stories that I've mentioned before. A woman named Phyllis Tribal calls texts of terror. They are horrific stories that we wish we could rip out of the Bible and not think about them. We will talk about those two stories next week and then conclude our time next week with the book of Ruth and how it might just be the most important book of the Bible. So hope to see you next week in person, online. Thanks for joining us. Hope to see you next week as well. Thanks all.